the reunion and goodbye. The following morning, Maya woke to the gray light of dawn spilling through the small blinds of her apartment. She had hardly slept. Her body still hummed with the adrenaline of the night before, and her mind spun relentlessly with both hope and fear. On her kitchen table lay the envelope containing the precious ticket, its glossy edges almost out of place against the chipped wood and stacks of unpaid bills that cluttered the surface. She sat before it with her elbows on her knees, staring as though the ticket itself might rise and carry her away if she only willed it hard enough. The reality was harsher. She had no use for a pass to a Vienna gala. What she needed was a plane seat to Chicago. Her first task was to turn someone else's luxury into her lifeline. By mid-morning, she had walked the length of half the city, stopping at resale agencies, online exchange counters, and even ticket brokers who looked her up and down with a mix of skepticism and greed. Each negotiation felt like another performance, her voice steady even as desperation knotted her stomach. Some scoffed at her, claiming they had no market for classical concerts, while others offered insultingly low sums. Still, she persisted. With each rejection, she pictured her mother's fragile hands, the sound of her cough, the frailty in her voice when she had begged Maya to come home. That memory gave her the steel she needed to keep pushing. By late afternoon, she had secured a buyer. It was not ideal. A music student who had scraped together money for months to attend such a prestigious event, but had been locked out by soaring prices. He could not pay the ticket's true value, but what he gave was enough. Enough to book the last seat on a red-eye flight to Chicago. Enough to ensure she would arrive before another night fell without her. As Maya handed over the ticket, she felt strangely at peace. She was not losing anything. She was gaining the one thing money could never replace: time with her mother. At the airport, the terminal buzzed with the usual chaos, rolling suitcases clattering across the floor, boarding calls echoing through intercoms, children crying, tired travelers staring blankly at screens. For most, it was routine. For Maya, every detail felt magnified, as if the world itself knew the weight of her journey. She clutched her modest duffel bag, its fabric fraying at the corners, and kept the boarding pass pressed against her chest. Each minute that passed was one closer to home, yet each second also carried a gnawing dread. Would she arrive in time? When the plane finally lifted off the runway, she pressed her forehead against the small oval window and watched the city shrink into a scattering of lights. Her thoughts wandered to all the years she had lost, not just to poverty and work, but to the surrender of her dream. She remembered practicing long into the night while her mother sat nearby, whispering encouragement. She remembered competitions where she had won not just trophies but admiration, the kind that hinted at a future as bright as the music she played. She remembered most painfully the day she put it all away, telling herself that her mother needed a caretaker more than the world needed another pianist. Tears burned her eyes as she thought of how easily she had convinced herself that she was finished, when in truth the music had never left her. It had waited quietly, a part of her that could never be silenced, and now it had saved her life. The flight was long, but sleep would not come. Instead, she closed her eyes and imagined herself back at the piano, her mother sitting near, smiling softly, swaying slightly as though she could feel the notes as much as hear them. The hum of the engines became a kind of accompaniment, a steady rhythm beneath her memories. When the announcement finally came that they were beginning their descent, her chest tightened with both relief and dread. Chicago greeted her with its familiar bite of wind, the kind that seemed to cut straight through her coat and burrow into her bones. She hailed a cab outside the airport, her hands trembling as she gave the driver the address of the hospital. Each street they passed brought more memories. The park where she and her mother had walked on Sundays, the small bakery where they once shared pastries when times were still good, the church whose choir had first discovered that little Maya could play like no one else. The city had changed, but its imprint on her life remained permanent, stitched into every corner. The hospital loomed tall and sterile against the winter sky. Its automatic doors hissed open, spilling warm, antiseptic-scented air onto the sidewalk. Maya moved quickly through the corridors, her shoes squeaking softly on polished linoleum. Nurses glanced at her, some offering polite smiles, others too consumed by their work to notice. When she reached the ward, her heart pounded so hard she thought it might shatter. She paused outside the door, pressing her palm to the cold metal handle. gathering the courage to face what waited on the other side. Her mother lay small against the wide hospital bed, her body dwarfed by machines and tubes that hummed and blinked. The woman who had once seemed indestructible, who had worked 2 jobs, who had carried the weight of their little family after Maya's father disappeared, who had cheered through every recital and competition, now looked impossibly fragile. Her face was pale, her hair thinned, but her eyes, when they opened, lit up the room with recognition. "Maya," she whispered, her voice rough but filled with warmth. "Mom," Maya choked out, rushing to her side. She knelt by the bed, taking her mother's frail hand in both of hers. Tears spilled freely now, unstoppable. "I'm here." "I made it." Her mother's thumb brushed weakly over Maya's knuckles. "I knew you would. You always find a way." For hours, Maya stayed there, speaking softly, listening to stories, sharing laughter through tears. They talked of old times, of the music that had once filled their apartment, of the dreams her mother still carried for her. "You were meant for more than this life tried to give you," her mother said, her eyes glistening. "Don't ever believe otherwise. Promise me, Maya. Promise me you won't let the world silence you again." Maya pressed her forehead to her mother's hand, her voice breaking. "I promise." That evening, as the sky outside turned from gold to deep indigo, Maya asked the nurse if the hospital had a piano. The nurse hesitated, then nodded. There was an old upright in the chapel. With permission, they wheeled it into her mother's room. It was worn and slightly out of tune, but to Maya it was perfect. She sat, placed her trembling hands on the keys, and began to play the lullabies her mother used to hum when she was little. The room filled with gentle melodies, fragile but beautiful, each note a thread stitching their hearts together one final time. Her mother closed her eyes, smiling faintly, and for a moment, the machines and the sickness faded away, replaced by music and love. When the last note faded, silence lingered. Maya looked at her mother and saw peace in her expression, a serenity that told her everything she needed to know. That night, as dawn threatened to break, her mother slipped quietly from the world, her hand still in Maya's. The loss pierced her, an ache so deep it felt endless, but she clung to the promise she had made. Music had brought her here. Music had given her this last gift, and music would carry her forward. Legacy. The months that followed Maya's first professional performance unfolded with a swiftness that left her both exhilarated and humbled. What had once been a quiet existence filled with long shifts and heavy grief now transformed into a life propelled by invitations, rehearsals, and the kind of attention she had never imagined receiving. Newspapers ran headlines calling her the waitress who played her way into history, though she hated how they clung to her old title, as if her identity could only exist in contrast to her poverty. Still, the coverage brought opportunities. Recital halls opened their doors, orchestras invited her to collaborate, and strangers sent her letters describing how her story had inspired them to pursue dreams they thought were lost. For every critic who dismissed her rise as a fluke, there were hundreds more who saw in her the embodiment of perseverance and authenticity. Maya, however, did not let herself be consumed by the glamour or the praise. Fame was a strange tide. It lifted her higher than she had ever stood, but she knew how easily it could turn and drown her. She remained anchored by the memory of her mother, whose voice still lingered in her mind like a steady melody. "Play like it matters, my love." Whenever she stepped onto a stage, no matter how large, she imagined her mother sitting in the front row, smiling, her hands clasped together in pride. It reminded her that this journey was not about proving herself to the world, but about honoring the promise she had made in a hospital room filled with fragile hope. Her path crossed with Charles Davenport's often in those early months. He had made good on his vow to open doors, introducing her to patrons, critics, and institutions that might otherwise have taken years to notice her. Yet what surprised Maya most was the change in him. The arrogance that had once defined his every word softened as he spent more time in her company. He asked questions about her music, about her process, about what inspired her. At times, she caught him listening in silence during rehearsals, his expression distant, almost contemplative, as though she had awakened in him a longing he had long buried beneath wealth and power. Their relationship remained complicated. She could never forget the way he had first laughed at her desperation. But gradually, respect replaced resentment. With every performance, Maya grew more confident, not just in her technique but in her ability to connect with audiences. She learned that music was not about perfection but about truth. The slight imperfections, the human cracks in her playing, often carried more weight than flawless execution because they revealed her heart. Audiences responded not to a machine but to a woman who had known hardship and loss, who had bared her soul through sound. Critics began to write not of her novelty but of her depth, calling her interpretations raw, emotional, and unforgettable. Yet even as her career blossomed, Maya could not ignore the voices of the past, not just her mother's but her own younger self. The girl who once dreamed of Juilliard and believed the world was closed to her because she lacked money and connections. She thought often of the children she saw busking on street corners, their cases open for coins, their eyes shining with talent that might never be nurtured. She thought of her neighbors' kids in Chicago, who had no access to instruments or lessons yet hummed tunes with instinctive rhythm. And she thought of her own mother who had sacrificed everything to keep her dream alive, if only for a while. These thoughts coalesced into a vision. She would not let the cycle of silenced voices continue. With her growing platform, Maya founded the Area Foundation, named after her mother's favorite word for a solo melody that carried above all else. The foundation provided instruments, lessons, and scholarships for underprivileged children with musical potential. She traveled to schools, community centers, and hospitals, not just to perform but to listen, to encourage, to remind others that their circumstances did not define their worth. Watching a child's eyes light up as they touched a piano for the first time brought her a joy unlike any standing ovation. It was her way of giving back, of ensuring that others would not have to wait until desperation forced them to reveal their brilliance. The foundation drew attention and support from across the world, and even Charles contributed resources, though Maya insisted it operate with transparency and equality, never as a vanity project for the wealthy. She remained fiercely protective of its mission, knowing that it was as much her mother's legacy as it was her own. And when she stood at the first gala fundraiser, surrounded not by billionaires and mocking laughter, but by children proudly performing on stage, she felt a sense of peace that eclipsed even the thrill of her greatest performances. Years passed, and Maya's name became synonymous with resilience and artistry. She performed in the grandest halls, Vienna, New York, Paris, Tokyo, each time bringing with her the memory of a dusty cafe piano and the sound of a crumpled napkin hitting the floor. She never forgot where she came from, never forgot the sting of humiliation that had once threatened to break her, because it was in that crucible that her resolve had been forged. And in interviews, when asked what defined her success, she never spoke of fame or wealth. She spoke of her mother's smile, of the promise she made, of the music that had saved her. On the anniversary of her mother's passing, Maya returned to Chicago to play in the small neighborhood church where she had first performed as a child. The pews were filled with neighbors, students from her foundation, and strangers who had been touched by her story. The piano was old, its notes slightly uneven, but when she sat down to play, the room filled with a warmth that transcended imperfections. She closed her eyes, feeling as though her mother's presence lingered beside her once more. The final notes drifted upward, hanging in the air like a prayer. When she opened her eyes, the audience was on its feet, but Maya did not look at them first. She looked instead at the worn wooden rafters, at the light filtering through stained glass, and whispered softly, "I kept my promise, Mom." And in that moment, Maya knew that her story was no longer about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving her mother right. It was about music not as performance but as legacy, a legacy that would echo long after the last note faded. A new door opens. The days following her mother's passing unfolded like a fog, thick and numbing, where time seemed to lose its structure. Maya drifted through them as if on autopilot, her body present but her spirit hollowed by the silence her mother's absence left behind. The hospital room where she had sat for hours holding her mother's hand felt burned into her memory, and each night when she closed her eyes, she replayed those final moments. The faint smile, the soft touch, the stillness that followed. Grief wrapped around her like a heavy cloak, making even the simplest tasks feel monumental. She had returned to her mother's small apartment in Chicago, where every corner bore a memory. The worn couch where her mother used to rest after long shifts, the chipped teacups they had shared during evenings of laughter, the old upright piano still against the wall, Everything whispered her mother's presence even as it screamed her absence. Maya sat often at that piano, her fingers brushing the keys without pressing them, as though afraid the sound would confirm how empty the apartment had become. When she finally did play, the notes emerged fragile, trembling with sorrow yet strangely cathartic. Music became both her refuge and her wound. It reminded her of everything she had lost but also gave her a way to survive it. Neighbors sometimes lingered by the open window to listen, offering small nods of respect or quiet words of comfort. They did not know the details, but they felt the story in her music, and that was enough. She thought little of the cafe incident during those first weeks of mourning. To her, it had been nothing more than desperation, a last gamble to get home in time. She had not noticed the man in the corner who recorded the entire performance on his phone. Nor did she know he had shared it online that very night with a caption that read, "Waitress humiliated by billionaire plays Rachmaninoff flawlessly in defiance." The video spread quietly at first, shared among classical music circles, then picked up by larger accounts that marveled at the juxtaposition of wealth's arrogance and raw talent's triumph. By the time Maya was even aware of it, the video had been viewed millions of times across multiple platforms. Comments poured in, calling her a prodigy, a symbol of perseverance, an unsung artist who deserved a stage far larger than a corner cafe. One morning, her phone buzzed incessantly with messages from people she barely knew. Former classmates, old neighbors, even distant cousins, all sending her the same link to the viral video. At first, she dismissed it with weary disbelief. But when she finally clicked, she found herself staring at her own image, hands poised over dusty keys, music flooding from her like an unstoppable tide. The camera shook slightly, the angle imperfect, but none of it mattered. The sound was clear and the passion undeniable. She watched herself with a strange detachment, as though the woman on the screen was someone else entirely. Someone confident, unbroken, fierce. Tears blurred her vision when she realized that person was her, and the world had finally seen her not as a server, not as a poor girl, but as the artist her mother always insisted she was. Opportunities began to trickle in through emails and social media messages, small concert halls offering free piano time, teachers offering to mentor her, local organizations inviting her to perform. At first she hesitated, doubting whether she had the strength to step into that world again so soon after her loss. But the promise she had made to her mother echoed relentlessly in her mind. Don't ever let the world silence you again. It became her compass, guiding her toward choices she would not have made otherwise. It was in the midst of this whirlwind that Charles Davenport reappeared in her life. She had not expected to ever see him again. In her mind, he was just another figure in the crowd of her past humiliation, a man whose wealth had made him blind to the dignity of those beneath him. Yet one evening, as she sat in the apartment sorting through condolence letters, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found him standing there, dressed not in the tailored arrogance of their first encounter, but in something surprisingly subdued. A simple gray coat, no entourage, no Rebecca on his arm. He looked out of place against the modest hallway, his expression unreadable but stripped of mockery. "Maya," he said almost awkwardly, as though unused to speaking without dominance. Her instinct was to slam the door, to shut him out of this sacred space that still carried her mother's scent, her laughter, her memory. But curiosity, and perhaps the faintest whisper of her mother's voice urging her not to close doors too quickly, kept her still. She folded her arms, her posture defensive. "Why are you here?" He hesitated, searching for words, then offered a small shake of his head. "Because I owe you an apology, and because I think you have no idea what's happening out there." When she said nothing, he continued, "That video of you at the cafe, it's everywhere. You've inspired millions, and while I may not have seen it then, I see it now. You are extraordinary. You deserve more than applause in a cafe or sympathy from strangers online. You deserve a stage." Maya's eyes narrowed. "And you think you're the one to give me that?" Charles did not flinch. "I think I have resources, connections, influence, but more importantly, I think you have something the world needs. And I'd rather help open doors than watch them stay shut." His tone lacked the arrogance she remembered. There was an earnestness that unsettled her more than his earlier cruelty ever had. She studied him for a long moment, torn between distrust and the quiet longing that rose in her chest whenever she thought of her mother's dreams for her. He represented everything she had once despised: privilege, power, the assumption of control. And yet here he was, humbled, seeking to make amends. Perhaps, she thought, even people like him could change when confronted with something genuine. Finally, she stepped back, allowing him into the apartment. He looked around, taking in the modest furnishings, the upright piano against the wall, the faded photographs on the shelves. His eyes lingered on a framed picture of Maya and her mother, both smiling widely at a recital years ago. He turned back to her, his expression softer. She must have been proud. She was, Maya replied, her voice cracking. And she wanted me to keep playing no matter what. Charles nodded slowly. Then let me help you honor that. Let me introduce you to people who can give you real opportunities, not out of charity, but because your talent deserves it. Maya hesitated, then moved to the piano. She sat, pressing a few quiet chords, letting the sound fill the room. If I do this, it won't be for you, she said firmly. It will be for her. For me? Good, Charles replied. That's exactly how it should be. And for the first time, Maya allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by waiting tables or survival, but by music. A door had opened, one she thought had been locked forever. And though stepping through it terrified her, the promise she had made to her mother gave her the courage she needed. The stage, the first time Maya stood behind the velvet curtain of a concert hall, her hands trembled not from the chill of the backstage air, but from the storm of nerves that churned inside her. The hall itself was unlike anything she had ever known. A grand chamber of polished wood and glowing chandeliers, where every surface seemed designed to magnify sound into something transcendent. Rows upon rows of seats stretched outward, already filled with expectant faces, their chatter a low hum that seemed to echo through her bones. For years she had imagined what it might feel like to stand here, to be the one at the piano rather than the one cleaning tables, and now that the moment had arrived, the weight of it pressed down on her until she wondered if she could even lift her hands to play. Charles had arranged this opportunity with quiet efficiency, using connections Maya never could have dreamed of accessing on her own. He had presented it not as a gift but as a challenge, saying simply, "You've proven yourself once, but music is not about single moments. It is about consistency, courage, and the willingness to bear yourself again and again. This stage will test you in ways that cafe never could." Maya had bristled at his tone, yet she had agreed, because deep down she knew he was right. Playing in defiance was one thing. Playing in expectation was another entirely. As she peeked through a gap in the curtain, she spotted familiar figures in the audience. Critics with notepads resting on their knees. Musicians she recognized from online performances. Strangers who had traveled because of the viral video that still circulated like wildfire. She overheard someone whisper, "That's her, the waitress pianist." And her chest tightened. The title clung to her like a chain. Waitress first, pianist second. And she wondered if tonight she could reverse it, or if she would forever be remembered only for the novelty of her story. Backstage, she paced, her steps quick and restless. Her palms were damp, her breathing shallow. She thought of her mother, of the promise she had made, and of how easily she could falter. The world might forgive an amateur, but a stage like this was merciless. Failure here would not just embarrass her. It could erase everything she had begun to build. When the stagehand finally gestured for her to step forward, the world seemed to tilt. She walked out slowly, her shoes clicking softly against the wood, the spotlight warming her skin even as her stomach churned. The applause that greeted her was polite, tinged with curiosity rather than devotion. She bowed stiffly, moved to the bench, and sat before the gleaming grand piano that dominated the stage. Its surface reflected the lights like a mirror, its keys pristine, a far cry from the dust-coated upright she had played in the cafe. She placed her hands on her lap, closing her eyes for a moment as the hall settled into silence. The first piece on her program was Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a work she had loved since childhood. It was a composition of contrasts, tenderness and fury, longing and triumph, a piece that mirrored her own turbulent journey. As her fingers touched the opening notes, she felt her breath catch, her heart racing. The sound was pure, resonant, filling the hall like water pouring into an empty vessel. Yet beneath the beauty of the music, her mind wrestled with doubt. Every critic's gaze felt like a weight, every rustle in the audience like a judgment. She thought of all the people who had mocked her, who might still be waiting for her to stumble. to prove she was nothing more than a lucky waitress who had dared too high. The anxiety threatened to unravel her, but then she remembered the hospital room, the way her mother had smiled through weakness as Maya played those lullabies. She remembered the promise, "Don't let the world silence you." She forced herself to lean into the music, to surrender control not to fear but to expression. The melody deepened, her fingers gaining confidence, her body swaying with the rhythm as though the piano itself was pulling her into its current. By the time she reached the stormy middle section, she was no longer thinking of critics or titles. She was thinking of survival, of grief, of resilience. She poured into the keys the ache of losing her mother, the humiliation of standing in that cafe, the small victories that had carried her here. Each note became a declaration. I am more than what the world thinks of me. I am more than their laughter, more than my fear. The audience leaned in, caught off guard by the intensity of her performance. This was not a polished conservatory student playing for accolades. This was a woman who had lived, who had suffered, who had clawed her way to this stage with nothing but raw will. Her music carried that truth, and truth has a power no technique alone can match. When she reached the piece's climactic ending, her hands struck the final chords with such conviction that the air seemed to vibrate long after the sound faded. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the hall erupted in applause, louder and more urgent than the polite greeting she had received at the start. People rose to their feet, their cheers echoing. Maya sat frozen for a moment, her chest heaving, tears stinging her eyes. She bowed, this time not stiffly but with genuine gratitude, her heart overwhelmed by the realization that she had not only survived but triumphed. Backstage afterward, Charles approached her, his expression unreadable. When she met his eyes, he gave a single nod, a gesture of respect rather than pity. "You've done what few can," he said quietly. "You turned your pain into something that moves strangers. That is the mark of a true artist." Maya sank onto a bench, her hands still trembling. "I thought I would fail." "And yet you didn't," Charles replied. "Because you remembered why you play. Hold on to that. Fame will come, opportunities will flood in, but none of it matters if you forget that your music is not about proving yourself to them. It's about speaking your truth." His words struck her deeply, and though she remained wary of his motives, she recognized that he was right. The stage had not broken her. It had revealed her. And for the first time she began to believe that perhaps she did belong here, not as a curiosity, not as a viral sensation, but as a musician whose story was only beginning. That night, as she left the concert hall and stepped into the cool night air, she felt the city around her differently. The streets no longer seemed indifferent. They seemed alive with possibility. She walked not as a waitress who once begged for a chance, but as a pianist who had earned her place through fire and resilience. Her path forward was uncertain, but she carried within her the certainty of something greater: her music, her promise, her legacy. The offer and the aftermath. The final chord of Maya's performance still seemed to reverberate in the air long after her fingers had lifted from the keys. The cafe had transformed in ways that went beyond the music. It was no longer the playground of the rich and arrogant, but had become, for a brief and luminous moment, a stage where truth eclipsed wealth. The people who had once mocked her now stared with an uneasy admiration, struggling to reconcile the waitress they had ridiculed with the virtuoso who had just bent the piano to her will. The applause had ebbed into a silence that felt heavier than noise, as if the audience feared that clapping too long would reveal how wrong they had been. Maya rose from the bench slowly, her legs trembling but her posture unbowed. She did not look for approval, nor did she scan the faces of those who had insulted her minutes before. She kept her eyes forward, chin lifted, holding herself as the musician she had proven to be. But she could feel the weight of their gazes, the shift in the atmosphere, the guilt of those who had thrown words and napkins like stones, and now found themselves silenced. Rebecca broke it first. She clapped her hands together once, slowly, her manicured nails clicking like claws against each other. Her smile was sharp, but it no longer carried the same confidence. It was the brittle grin of someone who had been outmaneuvered. "Well," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "That was unexpected?" Charles turned his head toward her, his jaw tense. He had not joined in the mocking earlier, preferring instead to let Rebecca wield the cruelty, but now he was visibly unsettled. His eyes, usually so controlled, betrayed a glimmer of something rare: humility. It was clear that he recognized what the others did not yet have words for, that greatness had just unfolded before them, disguised in an apron and calloused hands. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, feigning nonchalance. A deal is a deal, I suppose. You completed the challenge. She reached into her designer bag, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across the table toward Maya. Here, 1 ticket. Don't say I never gave a poor girl her fairy tale. Maya's heart hammered. She stepped forward slowly, took the envelope in both hands, and held it as if it contained something sacred. She could feel her throat tighten, but she refused to let tears fall here in front of those who wanted to see her beg. She nodded once, steady and dignified. Thank you, Rebecca smirked. Don't thank me too quickly. The orchestra ticket is valid, yes, but what you do with it is your problem. I expect you'll hawk it off to some desperate fan in exchange for a cheaper flight back to your sick mother. Charming story, really. Almost makes me wish I carried a camera. The cruelty of her words struck like a blade, but Maya did not react. She had already faced their scorn, and she had conquered it. Nothing Rebecca said now could strip her of the truth she had carved into that piano. She simply turned, clutching the envelope close, and began walking toward the staff corridor. But Charles spoke before she could leave. His voice was not mocking this time. It was heavy, deliberate. What's your name? Maya paused, turning halfway. Her eyes met his, and for the first time he did not look at her as if she were beneath him. Maya, she said softly. He nodded once. Maya, he repeated, as though committing it to memory. Rebecca scoffed. Don't start romanticizing this, Charles. She's a waitress who got lucky. But Charles said nothing more. He leaned back, watching Maya with an expression that even he himself did not fully understand. The backroom Tony, the manager, intercepted her as she passed through the staff door. His face was still flushed, though whether from anger or astonishment, even he seemed unsure. Maya, what was that? His voice was lower now, stripped of the harsh authority he usually wielded. I just played, Maya answered, her voice steady though her heart was still racing. You embarrassed me in front of Davenport, he said, though the words lacked conviction. Then he rubbed a hand over his jaw and muttered, but, God, I've never heard anything like that. You were incredible. Maya tucked the envelope into her apron pocket. I'm sorry if I crossed a line. I just needed a chance. My mother's sick. I have to get home. Tony sighed, his irritation fading into something closer to resignation. Go. You've done enough tonight. I'll cover the rest of your shift. Just don't expect your job to be waiting when you come back. Maya gave him a grateful nod. I understand. She grabbed her small bag from her locker, slipped out the back door, and stepped into the cool night air. A ticket and a choice outside, the city glowed with indifferent brilliance. Neon signs flickered, taxis honked, laughter spilled from bars and clubs. But Maya felt none of it. She clutched the envelope like a lifeline and leaned against the brick wall, trying to steady her breath. She tore it open and slid out the paper ticket, her eyes scanning the glossy print. An orchestra gala in Vienna, first-class seat reserved. Worth more than she could imagine. For someone like Rebecca, it was a plaything. For Maya, it was hope. She didn't need Vienna, didn't need the gala, but she needed what the ticket could bring. A flight back to Chicago, a chance to sit by her mother's bedside before it was too late. She knew she would have to sell it quickly, maybe even at a fraction of its worth, but the thought didn't matter. It was her passage home. Her hands trembled as she folded the ticket back into its envelope. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone, fragile and tired, saying, Just come home. Maya, please. She whispered to the empty alleyway, I'm coming, Mom, I promise. Watching eyes, what Maya did not know was that she had not walked into the night unseen. Through the wide windows of the cafe, Charles Davenport had continued to watch her even as Rebecca resumed her careless chatter. Something about the fire in her playing, the dignity in her silence afterward had unsettled him in a way no business deal or financial risk ever had. He was a man accustomed to control, to buying whatever he wanted, to dismissing lives as easily as signing a check. But Maya had not sought his money. She had only asked for a chance to prove herself, and in doing so, she had forced him to confront something he had long forgotten. The raw, unpurchased brilliance of human talent. When Maya disappeared into the night, Charles swirled the wine in his glass but did not drink. His associates were already returning to their negotiations, but his mind was elsewhere. Rebecca noticed and sneered. Don't tell me you're impressed by that little stunt. Charles finally drank, then set the glass down with quiet finality. "I'm not sure it was a stunt," he said. Rebecca rolled her eyes, but her laughter no longer carried the same confidence. The journey begins. Maya walked toward the bus stop, her body heavy with exhaustion yet carried by a current of fierce determination. The night air bit at her skin, but she hardly noticed. Every step was a step closer to her mother, every breath a reminder that time was running short. The envelope pressed against her chest as though reminding her she had one more chance, one final sliver of hope. She sank onto the cold metal bench, staring up at the sky. The stars were faint against the city's glow, but she found herself whispering anyway, as though speaking to them. "Please, just let me make it in time." For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe fate had not abandoned her entirely. The ticket, the performance, the moment of triumph, they were not coincidences. They were the beginning of something. She didn't yet know what, but she knew one thing with certainty. She would not waste it. As the bus rumbled toward her, headlights cutting through the night, Maya clutched her bag tighter and stood. The world had tried to remind her of her place, but she had answered in the only language she had ever truly known: music. And music, she realized now, could carry her farther than she had ever dreamed. Tonight it would carry her home. The prodigies touched the cafe, once loud with chatter and laughter at Maya's expense, had fallen into a hush that felt like the moments before a storm. The air carried a thick heaviness, as though every guest present sensed something more important was about to unfold than the casual cruelty that had been their entertainment moments ago. Maya sat before the piano, her back straight despite the tremor running through her hands. She stared at the keys, yellowed with age, some chipped along the edges, but to her eyes they were not worn-out ivory at all. They were a bridge to another life, another self she had long ago abandoned but never forgotten. She could almost feel her mother's hand resting lightly on her shoulder, urging her forward, whispering the same words she had always said when Maya doubted herself. "Play like the world has stopped to listen, my love. Play like it matters." Maya let out a slow breath and placed her fingers on the opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C minor. They loomed in her mind like mountains she had once climbed as a child but hadn't touched in years. The first notes thundered into the air, dark and commanding, startling those who expected timid fumbling. The sound was powerful, reverberating through the marble floors and against the chandelier's crystal. Heads that had been turned away now faced her. Eyebrows lifted. Forks paused midway to mouths. Conversations died completely. The storm had begun. Her mind, however, was not in the cafe anymore. It was drifting backward through time, each chord unlocking a memory she had buried beneath exhaustion and survival. She was 8 years old again, perched on a wooden bench in her family's cramped apartment in Chicago, the second-hand piano dominating the living room. Her mother, still healthy then, sat nearby folding laundry, humming softly. The neighbors often banged on the wall for her to stop playing after hours, but her mother always hushed them with a smile, saying, "She's not just making noise. She's speaking in her own language. Let her speak." Maya remembered those words now as the notes surged louder beneath her fingers. The piece demanded everything: precision, strength, emotion. It was not music for background noise. It was music that commanded attention, that tested whether a pianist had the courage to pour themselves into sound without fear. Her fingers pounded with controlled fury, then softened into delicate phrases that shimmered like fragile glass before plunging once more into depth and darkness. Sweat began to form at her brow, but her body remembered what her mind doubted. Years of discipline, hours of practice before the realities of life tore her away, lived still inside her muscles, hidden like embers that needed only the right spark. The audience was silent now, not with ridicule but with awe. Even Rebecca, who had folded her arms smugly moments before, now shifted in her seat, her expression caught between disbelief and irritation. Charles Davenport leaned forward unconsciously, his eyes narrowing as though trying to reconcile the girl in the apron with the music that was bending the air around him. This was no parlor trick, no desperate scam. This was mastery. Maya felt tears threaten at the edges of her vision as she reached the middle section, where the intensity softened into a haunting, almost prayerful passage. Her thoughts flickered back to her mother's hospital room, sterile and cold, the sound of machines humming, the fragile voice on the other end of the phone begging her to come home soon. Her chest tightened, but instead of faltering, she let the ache flow into the keys. Each note became a plea, a confession, a promise. If she could not speak her pain, she could play it. And in that moment, the piano became her mouthpiece. Her soul laid bare before a crowd that minutes ago saw her as nothing more than a server to be mocked. When the storm of chords returned, heavier and more insistent, she attacked the keys with a ferocity that made the instrument tremble. The cafe itself seemed transformed. It was no longer a place of chatter and wealth, but a concert hall. Every guest unwillingly transported. For the first time in years, Maya felt powerful. Not as a servant, but as an artist. The sound that poured from her belonged to no one else. It was hers, carved from pain, loss, and love. By the time she struck the final crashing chords, her chest was heaving, her fingers trembling, but the silence that followed was electric. For several heartbeats, no one moved. It was as if the room collectively forgot how to breathe. Then slowly, someone near the back clapped. Another joined, then another, until applause thundered through the cafe, shaking the chandeliers and drowning out the doubts that had haunted her. Maya kept her hands resting on the keys for a moment longer, her eyes closed, drinking in the sound. It wasn't just applause. It was vindication. For the first time in years, she was not invisible. She was not poor. She was not just a waitress in an apron. She was a musician, and they had all seen it. When she finally turned, her cheeks flushed and her eyes glistening, she saw a sea of astonished faces. Some looked guilty for their earlier cruelty, others simply stunned. But it was Rebecca's expression that struck her most. Disbelief curdled with something darker, the anger of someone whose entertainment had turned into humiliation. Charles, however, wore a different look entirely. His laughter had long since vanished, replaced by something that looked unsettlingly like respect. Maya stood, her knees weak but her spirit unbroken. She had met their impossible challenge not for their approval but for herself, and for her mother waiting miles away. The cafe encounter. The cafe wasn't the kind of place where people like Maya belonged. Not really. The walls gleamed with imported mahogany panels. The chandelier dangling above the entryway sparkled like an upside-down crown, and every polished marble table carried the scent of wealth. Clients arrived in pressed suits, silk blouses, and shoes that looked like they cost more than 3 months of Maya's rent. She knew her uniform, a plain black apron over a white button-down shirt that frayed at the cuffs, marked her as someone who served, not someone who belonged. But she needed the hours. She always needed the hours. Her paycheck had long ago stopped being about personal wants. It was about medical bills that stacked like bricks and utilities that needed paying. Today, though, she was stretched thinner than usual. A call had come that morning, the kind of call that turned the air heavy in her lungs. Her mother's health had worsened overnight. The doctor said time was short. Maya tried to brush the thought aside as she refilled a guest's water glass. She couldn't afford distraction. One mistake and Tony, the manager, would pounce. He never liked her much, always calling her daydreamer in a tone that made it sound like an insult. The cafe hummed with chatter. Business deals whispered behind menus. Laughter punctuated the clink of silverware. From the corner, faint dust motes floated near the neglected upright piano, its wood dulled from years of silence. Once, long ago, the cafe had hosted live performances. But these days, music had been reduced to a low playlist piped in through hidden speakers. Safe, polished, forgettable. Maya's eyes lingered on the piano as she polished cutlery near the service station. Her fingers itched. Her whole childhood had been wrapped around ivory keys, hours spent practicing drilling scales until her knuckles ached. She used to believe her hands would carry her to Juilliard, to great halls, to the shimmering lights of a career. But then her father left, her mother's illness came, and the money vanished. Dreams didn't put food on the table. She sighed and returned to work, ferrying a tray of cappuccinos to the Davenport party. The Davenports, Charles Davenport, was the kind of man who made heads turn. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with the kind of quiet arrogance that only billions in the bank could breed. He was known in the papers. A property mogul, venture capitalist, philanthropist when it suited him. His wristwatch glimmered like a small planet strapped to his hand, and every movement seemed calculated to remind those around him of his superiority. Beside him sat Rebecca, his companion of the week. She had the angular beauty of someone sculpted more than born, with manicured nails tapping rhythmically on the table, Her laughter cut sharper than glass. Around them, a few business associates leaned in, drinking both wine and the rare opportunity to be near money so powerful it seemed to bend the air around it. Maya approached, balancing the tray. 2 cappuccinos, 1 espresso, she recited softly, placing each cup with practiced grace. Charles barely looked at her. Rebecca, however, did, eyes running up and down Maya's uniform as if assessing a piece of furniture. "Thank you," Rebecca said, her voice sweet but tinged with disdain. "Careful with the foam. Charles is very particular." Maya offered a polite nod and retreated, but their conversation carried. "Extra tickets for the gala in Vienna," one of the men said. "The orchestra's season debut. Impossible to get seats, yet you managed." Charles leaned back, smug. "When you know the conductor, doors open." Laughter erupted. Rebecca sipped her drink and added, "We'll see if anyone's worthy of joining us." The word ticket snagged in Maya's mind like a hook. Vienna, flights, she'd checked earlier. Every cheap option was gone. She needed to get to Chicago, not Europe, but tickets, any tickets, could be bartered, resold, leveraged. The desperation in her chest swelled. Before she could stop herself, she lingered. A desperate offer. "Excuse me." Maya's voice cracked slightly, but she steadied it. I couldn't help overhearing. "You mentioned extra tickets?" The table fell silent. Every head swiveled. Rebecca arched a brow. "Are you asking to buy them?" Maya swallowed. "No, I can't afford them. But I was wondering if maybe, just maybe, I could offer something in return." "A trade," Charles frowned. "A trade?" Maya nodded quickly, her hands tightening on the tray. "I play piano. Trained for years. If I could perform something for you, here now, maybe in exchange you'd consider giving me a ticket. I need to get home. My mother's very ill." There was a beat of silence. Then Rebecca laughed, sharp and mocking. "Oh, this is rich. The waitress thinks she's Alicia Keys in disguise." One of the men chuckled. "She better play like Mozart's ghost for that kind of bargain." Another voice. "Sounds like a hustle. Trying to guilt the rich with a sob story." Charles leaned forward, his shadow falling across Maya. His tone was slow, deliberate. "You're a server. You pour coffee. You think because you plunked out a hymn or two in church that makes you a musician?" His eyes narrowed. "Don't insult this piano and don't insult us." Heat flooded Maya's face. She wanted to shrink, but she forced herself upright. "I'm just trying to get home. I didn't mean disrespect." "Pathetic," Rebecca muttered. Someone snorted. A crumpled napkin hit her shoulder, followed by a sugar packet skittering across the floor. Laughter rippled through the cafe. Maya's throat tightened. Her gaze darted to the piano in the corner. It loomed in her mind like both salvation and curse intervention. "What's going on here?" The booming voice belonged to Tony, storming over. His face red and his Bluetooth earpiece bouncing with each step. "Your server," Rebecca said coolly. "Just tried to extort us with a performance for ticket scheme." Tony's glare snapped to Maya. "Are you serious right now? Soliciting customers? In my cafe?" Maya opened her mouth, desperate. "No, I wasn't. I just thought you weren't thinking." Tony snapped. "You want to be an artist, do it on your own time. Not while you're wearing my uniform." Charles leaned back smugly. She wasn't aggressive. "Just delusional," Rebecca added. "Embarrassing, really. I expect higher standards here." Tony's jaw clenched. He grabbed Maya's arm, not harshly but firmly. "You and I are going to have a serious conversation in the back." "No, please," Maya pleaded, jerking away. Tears blurred her vision. "I wasn't begging. I just offered music and it's all I have left. My mother's dying. I'm out of time. I swear I didn't mean harm." For a heartbeat, Tony hesitated. Then Rebecca's voice cut through like a knife. "Wait." All eyes turned to her. She stood smoothing her blouse, a cruel smile tugging at her lips. "Let's have some fun," she said. Charles frowned. "Rebecca," she ignored him. "You claim you're good? Prove it. Play Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C minor. From memory." No sheet music. Gasps rippled through the room. Even Tony blinked. Maya's breath caught. That piece, it was brutal. A storm of chords and emotion, one of the hardest in the repertoire. Rebecca's smile widened. "If you succeed, I'll give you the ticket. And $1,000. But if you fail..." Her voice dropped cold. "You kneel in front of everyone here and apologize for wasting our time." The cafe went silent. Maya stood frozen, humiliation burning her skin. Every instinct screamed to run. But then deep inside, a tiny flame flickered. She thought of her mother, of nights spent practicing until her fingers bled, of dreams she'd buried but never fully killed. She lifted her chin. "I'll play it." Laughter burst around the room. Someone whispered, "She's serious." Rebecca smirked and sat. "Then let's hear this little miracle." Tony stepped aside reluctantly. Maya walked to the piano, her steps slow, deliberate. Every eye followed. Dust coated the lid, but when she brushed it aside, a warmth bloomed in her chest. It was like touching home. She sat, spine straight, hands trembling above the keys. Memories surged. 7-year-old Maya on her mother's old upright, dreaming of Juilliard, of concert halls, of standing ovations. Life had stolen those dreams, but here, in this moment, she could reclaim a sliver. She closed her eyes and pressed the first key.